The first scream cracked across Maple Hollow like thunder splitting open a blue sky. No one saw it coming, not in a town like this, a quiet Monday afternoon, late October, the leaves still clinging to the trees in shades of copper and rust, and Officer Adam Mercer was halfway through his turkey sandwich in the patrol car parked beneath the rusting water tower on Grant Hill. He chewed slowly, eyes skimming the sleepy residential lanes, not expecting anything but a routine day. Ace, his canine partner, a stoic 9-year-old German shepherd with a streak of silver under one eye, rested quietly in the back seat. They had fallen into a rhythm over the years. Predictable calls, barking dogs, the occasional speeding ticket. Maple Hollow, population 3,082, didn't stir much outside Friday night football and Sunday service. Then the radio crackled to life. Unit 12, we've got a 911. Domestic disturbance at 618 Willow Lane. Caller reports screaming. Possible physical altercation. Before Adam could reach for the gear shift, Ace stirred. Not the usual alert posture. He growled, low and guttural, a sound Adam had only heard once before, back when Ace cornered a suspect who had held a knife to a clerk's throat. The German shepherd lunged toward the rear window, whining, claws scraping the metal grate separating him from the front seat. Adam turned, surprised. "Easy, boy. We're going." But Ace wasn't waiting. In a sudden, violent burst of movement, he shoved his weight against the half-latched rear window and squeezed through with terrifying urgency. Adam shouted after him, slamming the car into drive, his sandwich forgotten as it dropped to the floorboard. Ace tore across manicured lawns, a black and tan blur of muscle and instinct. Adam's cruiser skidded to a halt in front of a modest white house with green shutters. The porch light flickered, though it was still broad daylight. The front door was open, barely, just wide enough for sound to escape. And sound did escape. A woman's cry, raw and desperate, burst from within. Then a second voicemail, colder than steel, sharp as gravel, barked something unintelligible. The thud of a body hitting wood echoed out, followed by glass breaking. Adam was out of the car, weapon holstered, adrenaline rising. He barely made it to the porch when he saw him. Greg Adams. Muscular, neatly dressed, a face so familiar around town he may as well have been carved into the courthouse steps. He stood over Rachel Adams, his wife, whose lip was split and whose hands trembled as she pressed herself into the corner of the living room. A lamp lay shattered nearby. The wedding photo above the mantel was crooked. But the man wasn't alone. Ace was already there, standing between them. No command had been given, but the dog's stance was unmistakable, protective, immovable. His teeth were bared, not in aggression but in warning, a deep growl vibrating in his chest like the hum of a machine ready to engage. Greg raised his hand again. Ace barked once sharp, controlled. Not a lunge, not an attack, but a message. That ends now. What the hell? Greg staggered back, startled. "Get this dog off me." "Don't move," Adam ordered, stepping inside, hand hovering near his taser. "Greg Adams, step away from your wife." "This is my house. She's my wife." "And that," Adam said, glancing at Rachel's bleeding mouth and the bruise blooming across her cheek, "is a felony." Rachel said nothing. She curled into herself, not like a coward, but like a woman who had learned that stillness could sometimes mean survival. Her eyes flickered between Adam and Ace, and for a second, she looked like she didn't know who to be more afraid of. "Ace," Adam said, his voice low, "stand down." Ace didn't move. He remained planted, gaze locked on Greg like he was tracking a predator. "Now," Adam repeated. Only then did the dog back up, slow and deliberate, pressing his body lightly against Rachel's leg. Not touching, just close enough to say, "You're not alone." Greg was cuffed in under a minute, swearing the whole time about misunderstandings and jealous neighbors and wives who drank too much wine. Adam had heard it all before, but something about the look in Rachel's eyes unsettled him. Not just fear resignation, as if she had expected help to come too late, or not at all. Outside, the neighbors began to gather. Curtains parted, phones pointed. Whispered speculation followed Adam as he guided Greg toward the cruiser. "This is a mistake," Greg hissed. "Ask anyone. I coach Little League. I built half the decks in this damn neighborhood." "That right?" Adam replied, opening the back door. "Then you should have known better than to put your hands on her." As he read Greg his rights, Ace remained on the porch beside Rachel. The dog didn't bark, didn't shift, just watched her with those intense amber eyes, as if he understood more than he should. Rachel finally spoke, barely a whisper. How did he know?" Adam looked up. "Who?" "The dog," she said. "He got here before you did, like he knew I needed help." Adam didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. Not one that would explain how Ace, trained but not psychic, had launched from the cruiser without a word, without a siren, without a command. But something inside him stirred. A memory from training. Dogs don't just listen. They feel. They respond to what others pretend not to see. That night, Adam stayed late at the station. Writing the report took hours, but what really kept him there was the body cam footage. He watched the moment the call came through. Watched Ace's ears perk before the dispatcher finished the sentence. Watched him lunge, whine, force his way out like he was chasing something invisible, something urgent. And in the middle of it all, one chilling realization struck him. Ace hadn't reacted to sound. He had reacted to silence, the kind of silence that screams behind closed doors. The kind no one else in Maple Hollow had been brave enough to hear. Judge Ellen Hawthorne sat alone in her chambers long after the courtroom had emptied, her glasses resting crookedly on the edge of her nose as she scanned the preliminary case file Officer Mercer had submitted. Outside the frosted windows, the town of Maple Hollow ticked on with its predictable slowness. Autumn settled into the town like a hush after a scream golden, still, deceptive. But nothing about what she'd read felt still or simple. Rachel Adams, kindergarten teacher 31, no criminal record, no complaints. Married 4 years to Greg Adams, local contractor and minor town celebrity. Churchgoer, volunteer baseball coach, donor to the city's Christmas Lights Fund, the type of man who always shook her hand a second too long in chambers after city council events. Now booked for felony assault with prior domestic disturbances under suspicion. What disturbed Judge Hawthorne most wasn't the injury photos, those, while painful to look at, were too familiar. It was the dog, or rather, the dog's instinct. The report read like a script from a courtroom drama. Ace had broken protocol, acted without command, placed himself between the attacker and victim like he'd been called, not by sound, but by something deeper. She stared at the surveillance photos attached Rachel, pale and silent, sitting on the porch steps, one hand curled into Ace's fur. The dog leaned close, but not touching, his eyes watchful, protective. The look on Rachel's face haunted the judge. Not relief, not gratitude. Something else, numb survival. Later that evening, Officer Mercer walked through the hallway of Hollow County Hospital, the sharp smell of antiseptic crawling into his throat. His boots echoed off the linoleum. Room 208. He didn't expect her to say much. Victims rarely did, not at first, but something about Rachel's posture on the porch lingered in his mind. That kind of silence didn't come from one fight. It came from years of erasure. Rachel sat on the bed, her lip stitched, left wrist splinted, a bruise like ink blooming across her jawline. She didn't flinch when he knocked, didn't speak when he entered. Just looked at him with the same exhausted eyes that had once looked at kids learning to spell. Mercer didn't ask how she was. It would have been cruel. Instead, he offered her a small folder with victim resource information shelter numbers, legal aid, counseling referrals. She flipped through it mechanically. He watched her hands, the tremble in her fingers, the way her thumb paused over the contact for New Dawn Shelter, transitional housing. "I have to go back tomorrow," she said suddenly. Her voice was a whisper, but clear. "You don't," Mercer replied, choosing his words carefully. Her eyes didn't lift. "Greg controls everything. The house, the accounts, my car, even my phone plan. The last time I tried to visit my sister in Westford, he made sure it didn't happen." He said nothing, just sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, the same way he sat with dying victims in traffic accidents, quiet, steady, present. Ace waited just outside the room, but Mercer could feel the dog's presence like a heartbeat. "You ever watch a whole town pretend not to see you?" Rachel asked, voice barely louder than breath. "Pretend like you didn't disappear piece by piece?" He nodded slowly. "I've seen it." She looked at him then, not hopeful, not pleading, just tired. "You know the worst part? Greg never yelled in public, never lost his temper around friends. Everyone loves him. The principal at school told me I was lucky." Lucky. Her laugh was dry, brittle. "I'm not even sure I exist anymore, Officer Mercer, not really." "You do," he said, then added, because it mattered, "and he's not going to touch you again." It was a promise, not a procedural statement, not a hollow assurance. That night, while Ace slept near the fireplace at Mercer's cabin on the edge of town, the officer reviewed the footage again. Not just the call, but the 911 recordings. The neighbor, a woman named Cynthia Ellis, had whispered the address like it was a confession. "I think she's in danger," Cynthia had said. "I should have called sooner, but Greg's important. People don't like trouble." That was the undercurrent of Maple Hollow. Manners over morality. A preference for polite silence over messy truth. Domestic violence didn't make headlines here. It disappeared between committee meetings and Sunday bake sales. In the days that followed, Mercer followed up with quiet intensity. Rachel had returned home, as she said she would, and though a restraining order was issued, it sat like a fragile spider web between her and Greg, technically protective, but easily destroyed. The dog knew first. Ace never whined in the cruiser. He'd bark at passing cyclists, shift if a toddler got too close to the car, but the week after the incident he refused to rest during patrols. Every time they passed Willow Lane he growled low and long, the hairs on his back rising. Mercer listened. Friday night, a second 911 call. Same address. This time from a different neighbor. Loud thumping, screaming. Then nothing. When Mercer arrived, it was silent. Too silent. The lights were off, curtains drawn, but Ace leapt from the car before Mercer even unlatched the door. In the backyard, they found Rachel curled on the ground behind the shed, barefoot, her nightgown torn, clutching a phone with a cracked screen. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, but her grip on Ace's neck was vice-like. Greg was gone. Inside the house, the dining table was overturned, plates shattered. A single wedding photo stabbed through with a fork. Mercer felt rage pulse through his body, not righteous anger, but the cold fury of someone who had seen this pattern before. The next morning, Mercer stood before Judge Hawthorne with an updated affidavit. "This man is escalating," he said. "She won't make it through a third time." The judge removed her glasses. "Do you believe she's in immediate danger?" Mercer looked her dead in the eye. "I think she's already past danger." And for the first time in her career, Judge Ellen Hawthorne signed an emergency order for a hidden shelter placement without the victim requesting it. It was risky, legally shaky. But something about that file, that photograph, and that dog's unnatural reaction told her all she needed. This wasn't a standard case. There were things happening in Maple Hollow hidden beneath the neat picket fences and PTA meetings that no one wanted to face. But Ace had faced it. He had heard what everyone else ignored. And now, so would the system. Rachel disappeared into the New Dawn shelter the next day, escorted quietly by Mercer and Ace. The shelter's director, Monica Hale, took one look at Rachel's face and said nothing, just opened the gate, handed her a new phone, and showed her a room with a locking door. That night, Ace slept at the foot of her bed. For the first time in years, Rachel Adams slept through the night without fear of being woken by rage. But the real story of what lay beneath Maple Hollow's silence was only just beginning to surface. Rachel had barely settled into the small room at New Dawn Shelter before the first message arrived. It was early, just after sunrise, the air still crisp from the night's chill. Her phone, replaced with a donated prepaid, buzzed softly on the nightstand. One message, no name, just a sentence that rooted itself in her bones. "You can't hide from me, Rachel. I always find what's mine." There was no signature, none needed. The possessiveness in those 9 words carried Greg's voice, even in silence. She showed the message to the shelter coordinator, who immediately reported the violation to the Maple Hollow Police Department. A restraining order had been filed the day after the hospital discharge, but Rachel already understood what it meant, a fragile line of ink and law that Greg could step over with nothing more than intention. Ace had been there when she returned from the hospital, briefly, as Adam walked him through the shelter gates for a quick check-in. The dog's eyes had locked onto hers with a calm presence she hadn't known she needed. He'd sat beside her on the porch bench, close but not crowding, his weight steady and grounding. And then he was gone again, back to duty. That morning, Rachel poured herself a cup of shelter coffee and sat at the corner table furthest from the others. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to share stories or sip lukewarm encouragement. The only thing she wanted peace seemed as elusive as safety. Meanwhile, Adam Mercer was digging. What had started as a gut instinct had morphed into an obsession. He hadn't stopped thinking about the look in Rachel's eyes the night Ace leapt from the cruiser. Not fear. At least, not just fear. There had been resignation, too, as if violence was something she expected. Something she had learned to anticipate. That haunted him. He pulled every record he could find on Greg Adams. Clean. No criminal charges, no restraining orders, nothing official. But a pattern doesn't need paperwork to be real. Adam reached out to the Cherokee County Courthouse where Greg had worked briefly as a subcontractor in 2011 and hit the first snag. A closed case, sealed. Civil matter, no criminal record, but an anonymous clerk hinted at the details. A girlfriend, hospital photos, financial settlement, confidentiality clause. Back in Maple Hollow, whispers were beginning to stir. An email landed in Adam's inbox late one night. No subject line, no sender name. Just a message. "I saw the story. I saw Ace on the porch. I was with Greg once. I still have nightmares." The sender signed only LG. He traced it to a woman named Laura Green, a Maple Hollow native. A familiar name in town. She worked part-time at the community center and had been close with Rachel years ago. Laura refused a phone call, insisted on encrypted email, but confirmed everything. Verbal degradation, threats, tracking her car, isolating her from friends. The relationship had lasted less than a year, but Greg had left a trail of fear behind her. Laura said she'd tried to speak up once, years ago, but Greg's father was still alive then. His connections in town were unshakable. She'd been told to drop it, that good men sometimes get angry. She'd learned to keep quiet and keep moving. The next day, a construction company whistleblower named Jay Alvarez called the department. Quiet at first, but once he heard it was about Greg, the floodgates opened. Jay had worked under Greg for 2 years and watched him manipulate the female staff like pawns, texting them late at night, making offhand comments about their clothes, threatening to cut hours if they didn't smile more. One had quit after she caught him following her home. She filed a complaint, but it vanished after a closed-door meeting. Jay had screenshots, text logs, photos of office memos with timestamps. It wasn't criminal on paper, not yet, but it was a pattern, one the town had chosen to ignore. Maple Hollow had a way of looking the other direction when its favorite sons misbehaved. Greg built decks for free for veterans. He helped repaint the rec center. He sponsored Little League jerseys every spring. He was, on the surface, the kind of man small towns celebrated. But beneath that surface, Adam was beginning to see the rot. He printed every email, compiled every testimony, lined it up like bricks. One by one, patterns emerged. The same language, the same tactics, control, isolation, fear, and always the smile in public, the threats in private. Meanwhile, Rachel remained cautious. The shelter was meant to be confidential, but Greg's message had made one thing clear. He either knew or he was guessing close enough to be dangerous. Security cameras were checked, locks double-checked. The director considered relocating Rachel temporarily, but she refused. "I can't keep running," she said. "If he wants to scare me, he'll have to do more than send shadows." Still, she didn't sleep. The nights stretched long. Any sound outside her window twisted her stomach. A car backfiring made her flinch. And in the quiet hours of early morning, she'd sometimes find herself sitting on the edge of her cot, staring into the dark, clutching the edges of the blanket like it might hold her together. But she was not alone now. Others had seen, others had heard, and Adam, along with Ace, was still watching, still listening. There were things this town had chosen not to see, things it had buried under politeness and prayer and the illusion of perfection. But those things had teeth now, evidence, names, a trail. And this time someone was following it all the way to the end. Rachel stood alone in the courthouse hallway, the overhead fluorescents humming above her like an unwelcome reminder of just how sterile justice could feel. The walls were lined with framed portraits of past judges and town leaders, men with names that echoed through Maple Hollow's politics and country clubs, names that now formed the very foundation Greg Adams stood on. Inside the courtroom, the bench was polished, the wood panels rich and deep, but Rachel knew better than to mistake formality for fairness. Greg's defense attorney, Jonathan Reed, was the kind of man who never raised his voice but could strip someone bare with a single question, each one coated in Southern civility and barbed implications. He called it reframing. Rachel called it what it was: erosion of truth, of memory, of her. The day Rachel testified, the temperature outside reached a humid 91 degrees. Inside, it was colder than any winter she remembered. She walked to the stand slowly, conscious of every creak in the floor, every shifting body in the gallery. She didn't look toward Greg, but she felt his presence like a stone in her chest. Across the aisle sat the members of the Adams family, polished, composed, familiar to every corner of Maple Hollow. Greg's sister nodded politely to the judge. His mother clutched a rosary. Reed began with charm, complimented Rachel's past as a teacher, asked about her flowers, her class decorations, the smile she used to wear. Then came the pivot. "Mrs. Adams, Is it true you once sought therapy during your college years for anxiety? Rachel's lips parted slightly. She hadn't spoken of that time in a decade. Yes, she said simply. And during that time, you were prescribed medication? Yes, for a short time. And did you stop that medication against doctor's advice? She hesitated. I stopped because I graduated and no longer had access to student health services. Reed offered a thin smile. So not because your condition improved, but because of circumstances. Thank you. Each question felt like a needle slipping under the skin, small but relentless. He wanted to paint her as unstable, emotional, unreliable. A woman who perhaps didn't know what abuse was, or worse, imagined it. But Rachel remembered everything. The bone-deep fear. The nights of silence broken only by her own stifled sobs. The pain hidden beneath cardigans and makeup. She remembered it all because she still lived it, even if the bruises had faded. When Greg took the stand, he wore his remorse like a well-fitted suit. He said he'd made mistakes, that marriage was hard, that Rachel struggled emotionally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deny everything, only reframed it until the truth was fogged in half-truths and suggestions. Reed's questions served up each point like a friendly dinner conversation. The courtroom nodded along. Then came the sound. Ace, lying beside Officer Adam Mercer near the prosecution's table, let out a low, unmistakable growl. Not loud, not showy, just a deep vibration that made the silence afterward stretch uncomfortably long. Heads turned. Greg froze mid-sentence. "Ace," Adam whispered, instinctively placing a hand on the dog's back. But Ace didn't move. His amber eyes locked on Greg, unwavering. For the first time all day, something shifted. The jury stirred. The prosecutor paused. Greg's confidence, so carefully controlled, faltered for a breath. A dog didn't lie. A dog didn't know strategy. Ace hadn't been commanded, he'd simply reacted. That moment didn't go on record. It wouldn't appear in transcripts or evidence lists, but it lingered in the room, in people's memories, and most of all, in the jury's eyes. Something primal had entered the sterile domain of law, and it had teeth. Over the following days, Rachel returned to the shelter, waiting out the process. Her nerves coiled tight. She stayed off social media, but others didn't. Her name was now in whispers at the Maple Hollow Cafe. People took sides in the grocery store aisles. Some offered tight-lipped nods of support. Others refused to meet her gaze. But the real surprise came 3 days after her testimony, when the doorbell at the shelter rang at dusk. A woman stood outside in a navy windbreaker, sunglasses in her hand, eyes heavy with memory. The woman began, hesitating. "I'm Laura Green. I used to date Greg. Back in 2009, he broke my collarbone. I told the police then, but it didn't go anywhere." Rachel led her inside. Laura wasn't the only one. The next day, Jay Alvarez, a former employee at Adams Construction, reached out to Officer Mercer. Quietly, off the record. "He followed 2 women home. We knew. We needed the paycheck. One girl quit and got a settlement. Signed an NDA. I think she was 17. The tide was shifting. The walls Greg had built, brick by brick, began to crack. Then, a final break. Another woman. Monica Reyes came forward. She too had been in a relationship with Greg years ago. She filed a formal complaint and joined the civil suit being prepared in tandem with the criminal case. She wanted her story heard. The DA moved fast, using the new testimonies to reinforce the charges. What was once a domestic dispute had become a pattern, a predatory pattern. Even Maple Hollow's newly elected mayor, Carla Jennings, held a press conference. "We are reviewing all procedures regarding domestic violence reporting and enforcement," she said. "No citizen, regardless of status or surname, is above accountability." It was the first time in years Rachel felt like her voice hadn't vanished into thin air. Back at the shelter, Ace rested beside her chair as she reread the day's articles, scanning each headline slowly. Her name was everywhere. Not just as a victim, but as a woman who finally cracked open a silence that had ruled too long. And somewhere, beneath the weight of years stolen from her, she felt the stirrings of something fragile and defiant hope. Greg Adams was sentenced to 2 years in county jail, not the maximum by any means, but in Maple Hollow it felt like an earthquake. For a town that had politely turned its face from bruises and whispered apologies, the conviction landed like a declaration. Greg, son of a legacy family, builder of neighborhood porches and Sunday school additions, now labeled as a convicted abuser. The sentence wasn't just about punishment. It was about exposure. The courtroom had cracked something open. Rachel didn't cry when the verdict was read. She didn't flinch either. She simply exhaled, like someone who'd been holding her breath underwater for years and was finally allowed to breathe. The courtroom blurred in her vision, not because of tears, but because the tight grip of survival had finally loosened its hold. In the weeks that followed, she didn't return to her old life. Instead, she built something new. She accepted an offer to return to Maple Hollow Elementary, not in her former kindergarten classroom, but as a reading specialist for early intervention students. She wanted to work with kids who were slipping through cracks, the quiet ones, the ones like she had become in the years with Greg. She bought a small cottage on the edge of the woods, the kind with creaky floorboards and wild lavender growing by the mailbox. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Hers alone. And Ace Once Officer Mercer's partner, now retired, was officially adopted into her home. He adjusted to civilian life as though he'd been waiting for it all along. His favorite spot was the wide front porch, stretched out beside Rachel as she journaled in the fading afternoon light. Some nights, when the wind rustled the pines just right and shadows moved along the walls, the fear crept back. Trauma didn't leave you just because a verdict was read. But Ace, always attuned, would press his head into her lap or nudge her hand until her breathing slowed again. In those moments, Rachel didn't feel brave, but she did feel seen. Each Wednesday, Rachel volunteered at the New Dawn shelter. She didn't counsel. She didn't lecture. She simply sat with new arrivals, some sobbing, some silent, and listened. She knew the power of being heard. Her story, once a secret she buried in layers of denial, was now a lifeline for others. One evening, she opened a letter slipped under the shelter door, unsigned. The handwriting was unsteady, almost childlike. "You don't know me, but I saw your face on the flyer. I watched your hearing online. I'm 15, and my stepdad hurts my mom when he drinks. I wanted to scream, but I thought no one would listen. Then I saw you. You screamed, and a dog came. Now I know it's okay to ask for help. You didn't just save yourself, you saved people like me before we got broken." Rachel folded the note carefully and placed it in the wooden box she kept for reminders, the little tokens of reclamation that kept her grounded. At the annual fall fundraiser for New Dawn, Rachel was asked to speak. She didn't write a speech. She never liked rehearsed words. When she stepped onto the modest stage at the community center, the room fell quiet. Some knew her from the headlines, others only as the quiet volunteer with the kind eyes and the dog who never left her side. She looked out at the crowd, survivors, advocates, teachers, students, neighbors, and then at Ace, who lay patiently by the podium. "He tried to erase my voice," she said simply. "But a dog heard it, and that was enough to remind me it mattered." Silence. And then a rising wave of applause. Not the polite kind. The kind that came from people who had bled too, from people still searching for their voices in the dark. Later that night, back home, Rachel curled on the porch with Ace by her side. The sky above Maple Hollow was clear, littered with stars. The town was quieter these days, not because evil had vanished, but because people had begun paying attention. More calls were made. More women spoke up. Change didn't come easy, but it had started because someone had listened. She pulled out her journal and wrote by porch light, "I'm not scared anymore. And when I am, I just have to remember someone once heard my scream and came running." Ace shifted, resting his head on her foot, content and vigilant. As the breeze carried the scent of leaves and wood smoke, Rachel smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew now her voice had stayed. It hadn't been silenced, it had echoed, and somewhere someone else would find the courage to speak because she had once dared to.